Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the concluding lecture on the third module that was to do with institutions and development. And what we will discuss today is the relationship between institutions and development in the Pakistani case, in the case of Pakistan's economy. I'd like to begin by recalling the definition of institutions that we began with, which is that it's essentially a set of rules. Rules can be formal rules or informal norms, but they are rules, and they embody incentives and disincentives for shaping or influencing the behavior of individuals and organizations. Being rules, whether formal or informal, they also have their enforcement mechanisms. So at the most general level, we can formally define with Douglas North institutions. Institutions, whether formal or informal, are a set of rules that together with their enforcement mechanisms structure human interaction. Now the reason why the reason why we study institutions in the context of economics and economic policy is that research by the new institutional economists has shown that institutions play a fundamental role in the performance of an economy. And their modus operandi, so to speak, the way this is done is that since institutions are designed, whether they are formal institutions or informal norms, they are designed to influence the behavior of individuals and organizations. So in the case of an economy, institutions influence the behavior of the production units as well as the individuals operating within those production units called firms. Now you can imagine that if you have an institutional structure which induces the development of highly efficient firms, firms that are on the basis of competition have become efficient, they hire on the basis of merit, they have incentives for innovation and hard work, you can then imagine that such firms would be able to contribute to dynamic growth of an economy at the aggregate level, and would be able to, through innovation and sustained productivity increase, be able to achieve sustained economic growth. On the other hand, if you have an institutional structure which restricts competition and therefore induces inefficiency rather than efficiency, it lacks incentives for hiring people on the basis of merit, and it lacks incentives for productivity increase or innovation, then clearly an economy that is composed of such firms will not be able to sustain growth in the long term. So that is the sense in which the new institutional economists hold the view that institutions play a fundamental role in the performance of an economy. Now there are broadly two kinds of institutional structures that we had discussed. There is the institutional structure of traditional societies or non-modern societies, which is an institutional structure. By non-modern, I don't mean societies of the past only. They can be existing today, but they don't fall in the category of dynamic modern capitalist economies. So an economy characterized by an inefficient institutional structure, or what Douglas North calls a limited access social order, is one that restricts competition and through the restriction of competition, it systematically generates rents for a coalition of elites. Rents, as you remember, we defined as roughly speaking unearned incomes, but more formally, rent is a rate of return on an asset, including skills, which is greater than what you would get in the best alternative use of that asset, whether skills or any other productive asset. So the economies of within an inefficient institutional structure are designed, the incentive systems and disincentive systems, the rules are so designed that rents are systematically generated for a coalition of elites. Now, we discussed how the purpose of generating rents for that coalition of elites essentially is to maintain order by maintaining some semblance of stability within that particular coalition, and assuming that members of that coalition are capable of mobilizing or organizing violence or disorder. If you bring the elites into a state of cooperation rather than conflict, then you can have order in some sense, or at least for a certain length of time. And so it is that political and social objective that underlies the functioning of inefficient institutional structures. But then at the economic level, we've observed that such economies which operate within an inefficient institutional structure are lacking in incentives to increase efficiency, productivity, innovation. Such economies are unable to achieve sustained growth. On the other hand, economies within what Acemoglu and others call an efficient institutional structure, or what Douglas North calls an open access social order, those economies which fall in the category of modern economies, they are characterized by open competition. Therefore, there are strong incentives for increasing efficiency, hiring based on merit, sustained productivity increase, and innovation. Now, innovation in a separate set of studies which were initiated by Professor Aghion at Harvard, those studies show that the deeper the innovations and the broader the scope of those innovations, the higher is the long-term growth of such an economy. And so such deep and wide-ranging innovations can really only take place within an efficient institutional structure. Okay, so then, having proposed, along with the new institutional economists, that institutions play a fundamental role in the performance of an economy, the next proposition then, after a very quick discussion right now, is that the distinguishing feature between developed and undeveloped countries is that the developed countries are able to sustain their per capita income growth over long periods of time, whereas the undeveloped countries or the underdeveloped countries are unable to do so. Now, that is not to say that underdeveloped countries don't grow at all. They do, but they grow in spurts. There are periods, brief periods, when in fact they can generate impressive GDP growth rates or good per capita income growth rates. But these periods of relatively high per capita income growth are followed by periods of low per capita income growth, or even zero or negative per capita income growth, so that the gains made during the high growth period are neutralized during the periods of low or growth or periods of stagnation or even negative per capita income growth. The consequence is that such economies, these underdeveloped economies operating within an inefficient institutional structure, which grow in spurts, they are unable to achieve a substantial increase in the per capita incomes of the people over long periods of time. And because their per capita income growth is relatively low, it's not very significant in terms of per capita income growth, the governments of these countries remain perpetually cash starved, because it's only when per capita income growth is high will the government's revenue growth also be high. Okay, and that is why such underdeveloped countries which are unable to sustain their per capita income growth generate inadequate revenues for the government. Such countries are characterized usually by poor infrastructure, poor availability of social services, while the opposite is the case in the developed countries, where because these countries are growing at high per capita income growth rates over long periods of time, they are able to substantially increase their per capita levels, income levels over the long run, and therefore also generate high revenues for the governments. And so their infrastructure, other things remaining the same, their infrastructure and the provision of social services is much better than that characterized by than that prevailing in the underdeveloped countries. Okay, so the first proposition was, in the context of this new institutional economics, is that institutions play a fundamental role in the performance of an economy. The second is that, in fact, then the distinguishing feature between developed and underdeveloped countries is that the developed countries are able to sustain their per capita income growth over long periods of time, while the underdeveloped countries are unable to do so and grow only in relatively brief periods of spurts, followed by periods of stagnation. Okay, just to give you an idea of what happens if you're able to sustain your per capita income growth over long periods of time, relatively long periods of time. Here's an interesting table. And what this shows is, in the year 2000, per capita incomes of various groups of countries in various income categories, and it shows the percentage of the years over a 20-year period, the percentage of those years in those 2 decades when their per capita income growth was positive. That is, the GDP growth was greater than the population growth. Now you find that in the non-oil producing category of countries, which is 27 countries, they experienced positive per capita income growth 84% in 84% of the years within that those 2 decades. Whereas at the bottom of the per capita income scale, countries with a per capita income of between $300 to $2,000 per year, there were 44 of them, and in their case, their per capita income growth was positive only for 56% of the years in the 20-year category. So this clearly shows that at least one of the important considerations, one of the important factors in substantially increasing per capita income growth of a country is that such countries are able to sustain their per capita income growth over a longish period of time. Okay. So coming back to this proposition that institutions play a fundamental factor in determining growth sustainability, and that this growth sustainability can really, one of the necessary conditions for growth sustainability is an efficient institutional structure, one which provides incentives to individuals and to firms to be efficient, to be able to and hire people based on merit, to have incentives for productivity increase, and most important, have incentives for innovation. And that powers, that that basis of innovation powers their long-term per capita income growth. Okay. The next table is an even more interesting one, because what it shows, we now have about 1,000 years of data on GDP growth, which was compiled by Professor Madison, and it shows the per capita income between two groups of countries. What are the developed countries today, and what are the underdeveloped countries or undeveloped countries today, from the year 1000 to the year 1998. Now, you will notice that in the year 1000 AD, the per capita income of the underdeveloped countries was in fact higher, the average per capita income of the underdeveloped countries was in fact higher than the average per capita income of what are the developed countries today. $440 in the underdeveloped case and only $405 US dollars in the case of those countries which are developed today. But within the next 500 years, what are today the developed countries, they overtake what are today the underdeveloped countries in terms of per capita income at least. And from then onwards, from the year 1500 onwards, you find that this gap between what are today the developed countries and what are today the underdeveloped countries, this gap in terms of per capita income between them grows quite rapidly. Now, it is around the 16th and 17th centuries that fundamental important changes in the institutional structure of the European, of the Western countries took place. And while many of the countries in what later came to be known as underdeveloped countries or third world countries, there those institutional changes, those changes in institutional structure which could induce competition and efficiency and productivity increase and technological change did not in fact occur. The latter group of countries continued to have a coalition, an elite coalition that relied on rent generation, and so the rules of the game in the case of their economies induced behavior on the part of the production unit and on individuals where unearned income or rents were generated for the elite. Okay. Let's bring these general propositions to bear in the case of Pakistan. And to make matters simple, let's just look at Pakistan's record of growth since 1960. That's what the next table shows. And what you will notice from these figures on growth, these are annual GDP growth rates, not per capita income growth rates, but annual GDP growth rates. Think of a population growth of around 3%, and you divide the GDP growth by 3%, and you end up with a per capita income growth estimate. But for the moment, the annual GDP growth, if you look at that, the table brings out clearly that we have a kind of up-down pattern of GDP growth. We have periods, relatively brief periods, going up to, let's say, a decade or so, when the GDP growth rates were relatively high, because, well, they were to some extent neutralized by the 3% population growth rate, but still you had relatively high rates of GDP growth in the Pakistani case during some periods, which was followed by periods of very low growth, almost zero per capita income or even negative per capita income growth rates. And so this up-down pattern of GDP growth resulted in a situation where our per capita income could not increase in a kind of dramatic, impressive fashion such that we could shift out of the category of middle income countries to the category of high-income countries, or from the category of what I would call underdeveloped countries into the category of developed countries. I'll explain near the end of the lecture what I mean by the specific sense in which I'm using the term underdeveloped countries as opposed to developed countries. Now, this is a graph which just puts in the form of a picture what your quantitative data showed in the earlier table. And here it's fairly clear that you have an up-down pattern of GDP growth. There are years when GDP growth is relatively high, and then there are years when it becomes very, very low. So we have an unstable growth rate pattern. And if you look at the trend rate, if you draw a trend line through that graph, you find that there is a declining trend in the GDP growth rate. Now, this is a period when, in the case of China and India, there was an increasing trend to the GDP growth rate. And Pakistan, because of its acute instability, the stop-go pattern of GDP growth, and its inability to raise, as I said, per capita income growth rate substantially, follows a downward trend in its GDP growth rate. The long-term trend is negative. Okay. So there is little hope, if you remain within the existing institutional structure, for Pakistan to shift out of the category of the underdeveloped countries into the category of the developed countries. And since it can't do that, and the constraints to making that leap from underdevelopment to development, the constraints are of a structural nature. They're rooted in the very institutional structure of the society and economy. Therefore, they don't have a snowball's chance in hell of ever, within this institutional structure, achieving the status of a developed countries. So I think it's a misnomer to, as the World Bank, I think incorrectly calls these countries developing countries. They are not developing countries, because to say that they're developing countries means that they're moving towards a status of becoming developed, whereas they're not. They're locked in the structure of underdevelopment. This brings me to the question of what do we mean by underdevelopment in this particular context. Now, I would call an underdeveloped country one which has systemic constraints to actualizing the potential of its people, actualizing the potential capabilities of its people, and bringing those developed capabilities to bear in the performance, in improving their own individual lives, and thereby in improving the life of society, economy, and state. There are systemic constraints to actualizing the full potential of society in terms of its creativity, in terms of its capacity for innovations and productivity increase. The institutions, both in the political sphere and the economic sphere, are so designed as to provide opportunities for the development of capabilities only to a few rather than to the many. For the large majority of people, they are deprived of the opportunities of actualizing their potential, actualizing their potential capabilities. Typically, what are those constraints? What is it that makes the environment adverse as far as limiting opportunities to a small group of elites is concerned? Well, for one thing, high quality education is restricted to the few rather than to the many. There's such a huge gap in, first of all, there's education even in the best universities in Pakistan is very, very poor. we don't have a single university that can qualify to be in the category of the top 10 or even the top 100 universities of the world. So, even the best universities have much, much to be done, but the gap between the relatively good Pakistani universities and the really hopeless Pakistani universities is vast. And you have a similar gap between the school systems. The schools which the children of the elite go to have a very different quality and level of education compared to the schools typically where the majority of the people go to. So that means that when these children graduate from pass out from the schools and then go out to the universities, those who pass out from the best schools and the relatively good universities of Pakistan have a much better chance of contributing to society in a variety of ways, including increasing their incomes, than the majority of the people who've been deprived of high quality or quality education at the school and university level. So this is a kind of economic apartheid that we've built in this country in terms of education at least. So here I was giving you an example of how in this sphere, particular sphere, education, the potential of society is restricted by virtue of the fact that you're restricting quality education to a few rather than the many. A similar thing is happening in the case of health facilities. Health facilities in general are abominable, extremely poor. Even the so-called best hospitals leave much to be desired in terms of the quality of expertise and quality of post-operative care or nursing care. But compared to the relatively better hospitals, which many of them are in the private sector, and the others, especially hospitals in the backward areas, there's a vast gap. And in any event, the overwhelming majority of the people are really unable to afford quality health care. And so you find that the majority of the people are in a state of ill health. We conducted a study on poor communities in 9 districts for the UNDP and discovered that 65% of the people we interviewed were sick at the time of the interview, and they were sick on average for 3 months. Later, the Pakistan Medical Council, in collaboration with the US Department of Health, conducted a study later than ours, and they came up with a figure of 73% of the people are unwell. Now, if you have that kind of situation of ill health, where basically the majority of the people are unwell, then you can't expect, even if they were capable of, or even if they were placed in a amenable environment of increasing productivity and working throughout their working lives and working 360 days a year and so on. And so their overall productivity is going to be low if they're suffering from ill health. So ill health, the asymmetry of health facilities with respect to the minority and the majority of the population is the second major constraint to actualizing the full potential for the development of human capabilities. Then there are asymmetries in terms of markets. Those whose parents don't have property, large properties, or those who don't have influence of some kind, political influence and social influence, they are unable to get access over productive assets. And productive assets like land and water and equipment and machines expertise in the production and provision of services. Those productive assets, credit, are limited to the few rather than the many. Labor markets are also asymmetric. If you come from an influential family, have a lot of clout, have you are able to engage in nepotism and get a high wage job, whereas if you don't have influence, usually even if you have a reasonably good degree, you are less likely to get a highly paid job. Similarly, if you're from a poor family, it's highly unlikely that you get access over the capital markets, highly unlikely that you're able to get credit, and highly unlikely that you'll be able to access land if you're in the agriculture sector. So therefore, what I'm trying to say is that the availability of opportunities for actualizing the potential of people, the potential capabilities of people, those opportunities are systematically restricted to the few, and the majority are deprived of those opportunities. You can guess fairly quickly that the consequence of such a economic and social structure, an institutional structure, will be that the full potential of that particular society will be restricted. And that is what I call underdevelopment. It is underdevelopment because when the potential of the people is restricted, is restrained, then the creativity of society is restrained. The capacity of society to innovate is restrained. The very capacity of society to contribute to civilization is restricted, because a contribution if you are able to have a large number of people across different social groups who have actualized their creative possibilities, then those people can contribute not only to the economy and society, but to civilization itself. You might have a potential for being a painter, you might have a potential for being a poet, another person may have a potential for being a sculptor. If that potential were actualized and you were actually given opportunities through which you could express your talent, you'd have a large number of artists and you would have fantastic literature being produced and works of art. That's a contribution to civilization. Another person may have the potential of being a good teacher. And if he or she doesn't have the opportunity to develop that God-given capability, you won't have outstanding teachers of a large enough number to run good universities and schools. Yet another person from the poor may have a great potential to be an engineer, an inventor. He's lost. Vast numbers of people I have seen during my field work and my various other developmental endeavors across Pakistan, that there's a vast number of little children from poor families who have a spark in their eyes. And I'm convinced that this is a great potential of our society. We're a very creative society. If that potential were actualized, economic development would follow, would be a natural outcome of that actualization of potential. And it is that potential that is being restricted within the institutional and economic and social structure of our societies. And that is what I mean by underdevelopment, the incapacity to actually achieve development in any dimension of that term, whether art or literature or teaching or engineering or science or whatever. Okay, so we are an underdeveloped country in that sense, because our institutional structure and our political system and our social structure is so designed that over a long period we have not been able to provide an equality of opportunity to our people. Now, equality of opportunity doesn't mean that everybody becomes equal in terms of income, but equality of opportunity means that you don't really know who's talented and who's not, and if you provide an equality of opportunity, talent will flourish and emerge, and it is that talent that can be brought to bear for the development of that civilization. I use a more general term of civilization because it has many, many dimensions other than the economic. Those countries which have achieved sustained economic development have, in a sense, been able to develop different dimensions of society and talent, not just in the economic sphere. Okay. Now, over the last, I would say, 30 years, last 3 to 4 decades, there's been a new phenomenon which wasn't there in the 19th and 20th, early 20th, middle 20th century. And that is that a number of countries who were underdeveloped in the sense that we just discussed, and they were underdeveloped in the sense that they were in the low income category of countries also. They were poor countries. A number of those poor, underdeveloped countries have shifted into, have gotten onto a path of development where they've been able to bring about a sharp increase in per capita incomes, and have been able to produce a huge middle class with a wide range of talents, with the capacity to innovate and contribute to productivity increase. And such economies which have pulled out of underdevelopment have a kind of dynamism which was not observable over the last 200 years of their history. There are a number of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Brazil and Chile in Latin America, Puerto Rico in that area. In Africa, you have South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and in Asia, you have China, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and closer to home, India. These are countries that have dramatically increased their per capita incomes and have shifted from the category of underdeveloped countries to high growth economies. They're economies of such high rates of GDP growth that they're powering the growth of the world economy. So that's a dramatic change in these countries. Now, there are certain common factors to these countries, and let's examine those very, very quickly. Now, these factors that I'm just going to identify there's a kind of typology. So, there may be countries like India which are not positive in terms of all these factors that I'm going to show, but many of those factors are present in India. Many more factors are present in China, many more factors are present in South Korea. So, you have the factors I'm just going to identify as being an impetus, as being the impetus to that transformation. So, we need to understand development now in terms of not minor marginal accretions to per capita income growth, but to transformation. Now, what do I mean by transformation? What do we mean by transformation? By transformation, we mean that you have a dynamic change in a number of different spheres in society. Now, economics has not dealt with this before, that you have a dynamic change taking place in a number of different spheres simultaneously. These could be in the political sphere, in the cultural sphere, in the social sphere, in the educational sphere, and in the economic sphere. And the point is that the dynamism of these variety of spheres within which changes are taking place they play off each other, they reinforce each other. So that, once that dynamism has been set into motion within a variety, a broad range of spheres of that society, in economy and polity, then you have a rapid process of transformative growth, transformative development. Okay, what are those? Now, the economics over the next 10 years, as it develops as a subject, we'll have to begin to deal with these, because these are observable facts, right? They may, at the moment, seem to be outside the domain of economics and economic development, but are very much part of it, except that the science of economics, within its restricted sphere at the moment, has not really been able to conceptualize these and internalize these in its methods of analysis and policy making. Okay, the first is the development of a new set of a set of ideas. Big changes take place on the basis of the development of ideas, right? And these ideas could be generated by a relatively small number of people. I mean, the Enlightenment, for example, in Europe, however you might look at it, was induced by a few brilliant minds who were communicating with each other. So the development of a set of ideas, and what is equally important is that these ideas are produced by organic intellectuals, by thought leaders, by thinkers who are born and bred within the country and who are part of the historical tradition of thought of that country. You can't import intellectual transformation. You can't get consultants from somewhere else, from the IMF and the World Bank, and come and tell you how to achieve the transformation of your economy and society, right? It has to be rooted within the so-called genius of the people and their history and their culture. That's the first thing. The development of a set of ideas by organic intellectuals which can fire the imagination of the people. So they have to be, if they're organic intellectuals, they'll be able to connect with the people through their ideas, and which form the basis of devising a new development vision. So these organic intellectuals produce a set of ideas that fire the imagination of people, so the people own them as being part of their agenda for the future, and which form the basis of devising a new development, a long-term development vision. This development vision, as I said, can't be just economic, how to achieve stabilization, or even how to achieve growth. It has this development vision has to encompass cultural, political, social changes, modes of thought and feeling, journeys within and journeys without have to come together, as we discussed in the earlier lecture. Okay, the second condition, the second feature of countries which have achieved transformation is the emergence of a leadership with integrity. But it is not just a leadership with integrity. I mean, you can have a stupid set of leaders who are very, very honest, but they won't be able to get anywhere. What you need is a leadership which has integrity and can formulate a long-term vision of development based on the philosophical ideas, culture, core values of society, and aspirations of the people. The aspirations of the people which have been fired by those organic intellectuals and their ideas. So the leadership of such a country is necessary. Now, there's no place in economics for this kind of phenomenon, but it's there. You've seen successful countries have the emergence of such a leadership which has integrity and which can formulate a long-term development vision that's based on the philosophical ideas, the culture, the core values of society, and the aspirations of the people. Here's the third one. Let's suppose that you have a leadership with integrity and which is able to have, which has the intellectual wherewithal to formulate this development vision based on the aspirations of the people and the culture and history of that country. How does it actually implement it? What it requires is a bureaucracy that is bought into the vision of that political leadership. It has to be committed to that vision. And not only committed, but that bureaucracy has to be organizationally restructured so as to be incentivized to produce the outcomes that are inherent to that development vision. Right? So it has to be committed to the development vision of the leadership first. Secondly, it has to be professionalized. At least large sections of that bureaucracy need to be professionalized, because in modern policy making and policy implementation requires very specialized skills, as you'll have understood by being in this program so far. You need to know what big data techniques are, what data science is, and how do you apply it, and you need to be able to use computer techniques to build algorithms and do machine learning to be able to use that big data to produce analyses. Now, that's highly specialized kind of skill. Just as there is a highly specialized skill, although it's much more interdisciplinary, in the case of development policy. Highly specialized skill as far as finance and financial policy is concerned. So you might have generalists in the bureaucracy who have an overall understanding of society and where it should be going, and they're linked up with the leadership. But it also has to have a large section which is in the business of policy formulation and policy implementation. They have to be, in a sense, professionals. So you need, in other words, a bureaucracy that's committed to the development vision of the leadership, firstly. Secondly, it has to be, large parts of it have to be professionalized. Thirdly, it has to be incentivized with clear time-bound goals. You will get a certain amount of money, a certain level of promotion at X point in time in the future if you produce these outcomes. Okay, these are time-bound goals that have to be given to civil servants, and along with those time-bound goals, there have to be incentives for them to be motivated to go for those goals. The fourth is that in order to have time-bound incentives, time-bound goals with incentives, you have to have a monitoring system in the bureaucracy. You've got to be able to monitor them in a scientific fashion. Both monitoring how they're progressing through time on every 6 months or every year, how they're progressing towards the goals, and be able to evaluate them in a systematic, objective, fair fashion. It's only when you have a monitoring and evaluation system in place which is transparent and which is objective and fair will the bureaucrats respond to the incentives. Right? So the monitoring and evaluation system is very important. These 4 types of changes have to be brought about in the bureaucracy to be able to sustain the implementation of your development vision. First, a bureaucracy that is committed to the development vision of the political leadership and of the people. Secondly, it has to be professionalized, large parts of it. Thirdly, it has to be incentivized to meet certain time-bound goals. Fourthly, there has to be a proper monitoring and evaluation system for those civil servants. So you have a new kind of bureaucracy. Okay. What's the third element in the success story of these countries? The third element is that they initiate changes in the institutional structure of the economic and political system to place the country on the path of transformation. The institutional changes that I had been talking about earlier. You've got to have an institutional environment, an environment of rules, an environment of incentives and disincentives within which people will actually perform, will be induced to actualize their creativity, whatever that is, actualize their productivity, their capacity to innovate, achieve efficiency, be able to work hard. Okay. So institutional changes, this is at the formal level. Formal rules have to be put into place to be able to provide the right incentives for your economic actors and political actors. The purpose of these institutional changes in the institutional structure of economy and polity or the political system is to nurture talent. It's simple, it's to nurture talent and develop the human capabilities of society. It is the development of human capabilities across a wide front in society that powers the long-term development of the country in every sense of the word. Cultural, social, political, economic, civilizational development. And finally, countries that are embarked on the path of transformation are also countries that start a process of social and cultural change, a change in the normative structure that underpins economic and political development. You've got to have a set of values. One of the dominant features of Pakistan, if you look at it if you look at the country objectively, and if you're old enough, you'll have noticed this happening over the last 30 years, that there has been a deterioration in values. People by and large spoke the truth, or they felt guilty about lying. Now, lying is a very generalized phenomenon. People used to keep promises as an emblem of their good character and credibility. Now people break promises left, right, and center. People in the old days used to think corruption is bad. If you were in the civil service and you were even seen going to the house of a minister, you were assumed to be falling under the influence of the minister. Or if you a much worse crime would be to take a bribe from someone, then you were blackballed out of the civil service. You were out of the club. So there was certain values which underpinned the integrity of society and political system. It is those values which have deteriorated. And the point is that those values must come back into full play. You have to bring about those cultural and social changes on the basis of which you develop a set of core values in terms of which people, in a personal sense, are able to measure the validity of their behavior. What Aristotle and Plato called virtue. If you think nothing of doing evil at different levels, society can't move towards goodness. Whatever the formal institutional structure might be, whatever the formal rules might be. You might keep saying that we are concerned with the people, but actually you might just be filling your own pockets when you come into power and think nothing of it. You're not going to be able to develop. You keep saying that we think that students are very important, they're the future of the nation, and Yet when they come out and protest on the street asking for the fundamental right of free association, forming unions, you pick them up in the middle, from the universities, you abduct them, and you charge them with treason. You can't do that you can't have that kind of contradiction. On the one hand, say that our students are very important for the country, or for our future, this, that, and on the other hand, you do this skullduggery against them. Criminal behavior by the state. You can't do that. So what I'm saying is that the final element in the transformational development of a country is the rediscovery of a set of core values, of a sense of social responsibility, of integrity, of love, of compassion that has to be built into our consciousness, and therefore form the basis of a public action, whatever that action is, whether it's policy making or political action. Okay, I'll summarize the elements. So what I think are transformative development. You won't find this in the books at the moment. They haven't come into books so far, but they will one day. The first is the development of a set of ideas which are generated by organic intellectuals who are rooted to the society, which can fire the imagination of the people and which can form the basis of devising a development vision. Those ideas by organic intellectuals will only fire the people if those ideas fire the imagination of people, if those ideas stimulate some distant memory of their core values, of what those people stand for fundamentally. And it is that perception of people as a nation in terms of certain shared core values that has to come into play in the devising of that development vision. Okay, that's the first one. The second is the emergence of a leadership with integrity, and which has the ability, intellectual ability, to formulate a long-term development vision. By intellectual ability, I mean it in the medieval sense, as I said last time. Intellectual in terms of not just the ability for reason, but a kind of spiritual, transcendent ability, an ability to experience the transcendent. Both reason and spirituality, knowledge and love have to come together in that leadership as it defines the future of that country. The third, as I said, is a restructured bureaucracy, which is committed to the development vision of the leadership and of the people, which is professionalized, which is incentivized, and where adequate monitoring and evaluation systems are in place. The fourth is to initiate changes in the institutional structure. As we know, this model will be concerned about institutions, and you know what changes in the institutional structure means in terms of changing the formal rules of the game. Only then can a different type of game be played. Right? If you want people to play as a one-day game, you can't have rules for the 5-day test. Right? So those institutional changes have to take place for transformation, formal. And then you've got to have changes in the culture and values of society, which are the informal norms that we talk about, which are essential to an institution. An institution it's not enough to have formal rules. Formal rules can only work if they're embedded in informal norms. I was listening to a video of a former Chief Justice, Naseem Hasan Shah, on television, and the anchor, the interviewer, asked him, you have not initiated anything, you passed judgments which are against the, you let the military came and intervened and overthrew the constitutionally elected government, and you forgave it, you accepted that action, and you adjudicated as if to say that they were justified under the law of necessity. And you know what he said? He said, judges are human beings. If you have armed people standing on top of their heads, and they know that's the only power around, they have to compromise. He said, for these rules, if the judges know that there are people who come out onto the streets, then they would protect the Constitution. So this confirms my old view that I presented to you much earlier, that ultimately the defenders and preservers of the Constitution are the people themselves. It's only when the formal rules of the Constitution are felt to be part of the core values of that society that will that society get that sense of outrage every time the Constitution is violated. And that sense of outrage which brings masses of people onto the street if the government or state organizations dare to violate that Constitution or abrogate that Constitution, that is the ultimate deterrent for any usurper. And that's the point that the Chief Justice was making. His brother told me when who's a relative, when they hanged Bhutto, the Supreme Court passed a judgment hanging Bhutto. When the same, and I asked him, I said, the same Chief Justice, I talked to him earlier while the case was before the High Court, and he said there is no case here because in order for a conspiracy trial to take place, which is based on an approver, the fact of the conspiracy has to be established independently of the evidence of the approver, and there is no such thing here, so there is no case. And yet, when the case came before the Supreme Court after Maulvi Mushtaq's High Court, they hung him. So I asked him, how did that happen? Because I heard with my own eyes what the Chief Justice had to say. He said, Shah ji, har ek nu apne bibi bache pyare honde. A man was hung because that sense of outrage which a nation should have when its core values are violated, when its fundamental sense of justice is violated, that sense of outrage was not there on a mass scale. It was there for a few people who set fire to themselves, but not on a mass scale. It didn't stay the hand of the military dictator, nor of the judiciary. So that is why formal rules, in order for them to be sustained, have to be embedded, in my view. By the way, a student of mine, Sadaf, has done a first-rate thesis on this relationship between formal rules and informal norms. You can discuss the matter with her. But my sense always has been that for formal rules to be sustained, they have to be embedded in informal norms. The informal norms must reinforce the formal rules for them to be implemented. And for the most fundamental rule that you have, the apex institution, the Constitution, if it is to be preserved and defended, it can only be preserved and defended in the ultimate sense by the people themselves. Otherwise, every dictator who has abrogated or suspended the Constitution or distorted it out of shape through ordinances has been able to get away with it. He's got no fear of the people. Ziaul Haq, when he came and abrogated the Constitution or suspended it, he said, what is this Constitution? It's not a sacred document. I can tear it up and throw it away anytime I want to. Now, for him to be able to say that meant that that document, the values underlying that document, the formal rules, were not there in the people. That sense of outrage was not there. So that is why initiating a process of social and cultural change for the normative structure of that society that underpins the economy and polity, that is also important. Okay, got it? I think we'll end there. Thank you.